Hello and welcome to Conflict Decoded, where we explore the dynamics that trap us in conflict in our workplaces and community groups and how we can break free. I'm your host, Katherine Golub, joining you from the ancestral lands of the Pecumtuck people, currently known as Greenfield, Massachusetts. A Facebook friend recently sent me a Canva picture with a caption, quote, "Socialist town councilor and her sidekick, Golub, are hell-bent on transforming Greenfield." My friend had posted the headshots of my fellow city councilor and myself over the images of two women getting to work. And receiving this sweet art from a friend, along with a note of gratitude for all that we've been doing for the town, made me laugh. And then I asked to see the original comment that my friend was quoting from. It was a Facebook post that someone had made, which included classist comments and inaccurate statements about a housing development that my colleague and I are supporting right now. Reading this comment definitely felt a little unsettling, but it mostly made me feel grateful. When I joined the council, I committed myself to not look at Facebook. And so now when I hear that people are saying nasty things about me there, which is really rare, I get the heads up from a loving friend. And while I'm grateful for how this practice helps me navigate political conflicts that arise in my community, it can be such a struggle to discern how to interact with the information chaos of these times and to navigate the conflicts that are spurred and inflamed by it. So, if you are struggling in your relationship with social media and online news and how it inflames conflict in your community or in your workplace, then my conversation with Danielle Reiff is for you. Danielle is a peace builder, a writer, and the editor of Overcoming Information Chaos, a guide to building peaceful communities in the digital age. As a member of the U.S. Diplomatic Corps for 20 years, Danielle specialized in supporting democratic transitions and peace building around the world. After retiring, she founded the Nonpartisan Peace Builders Initiative to promote empathy, dialogue, consultation, and nonviolence for advancing social change and political reform. Danielle has been a Baha'i since 1997. If you feel overwhelmed by everything that you read online, torn between wanting to keep up with what's happening and wanting to protect your peace, or if you're struggling with how online conversations foment conflict in your community or your workplace, then I think you'll enjoy this conversation. You'll notice that I take a very long pause midway through the episode. That's not the sound cutting out. That's just me pausing to discern where to go next. I do that a lot while I'm interviewing my guests, and I usually edit these out, but I thought that you might enjoy Danielle's reflection on this practice, so I kept it in this time. As you listen, I invite you to ask yourself the question, what practice might you commit to help you navigate the information chaos of these times? And finally, if you work for social change and are grappling with frustrating, baffling, or draining interpersonal dynamics in your organization, community, or group, and you would like some support getting clear about what is going on in your next steps, then I invite you to apply for a free 1 hour conflict assessment with me. To do so, you can visit callingsandcourage.com/conflict-assessment and fill out the application form there. Then we'll get on the phone. I'll ask you a bunch of questions about what is going on. And based on what you share, I'll offer insights, share resources, and recommend next steps. I'm aiming to do 10 free conflict assessments per month for the next few months, so please tell your friends. Again, you can apply at callingsandcourage.com/conflict-assessment. I'd love to hear from you. Welcome, Danielle. I know that you've been busy organizing federal workers, and I'm grateful to you for that work and grateful to you for taking the time to have this conversation today.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to chat with you.
What called you to write a book on overcoming information chaos in these times?
Yeah, two things happened that pushed me to write this particular book. One is, as we have spent more and more time online and on social media in recent years. I've seen so many people forwarding things or sharing things that for me, there was a clear issue of bias or the logic just didn't add up. And of course, everybody starts by debating people online, but I very quickly saw that individual back and forths weren't efficient. It's just not an efficient use of my time. So I thought there has to be a better way to help improve the overall quality of what's happening on social media without having to jump in and have those discussions with individual people. And then the second thing that happened was I'm a serious meditator and I was deep in meditation one day. It was early 2024. And I actually had the insight deep in meditation that I should write a book about media literacy. And I never really considered myself an expert in media literacy, but the more I thought about it, the more I realized that was perhaps the answer to this question I had been grappling with of what can I do usefully, constructively to help improve the quality of what's happening, at least in my own social media feed. And so I decided to write this book.
I can definitely relate. When I joined the city council in my town 3 years ago, I decided not to spend any time on Facebook. And occasionally people send me things on Facebook that are being said about what's going on in the city. And so often there's just pieces that are skewed. Like some of it is right, maybe 70%, but then there's this other 30% that is not quite right. And so that really gives me a felt sense of the misinformation that's out there on social media. And then the inefficiency. I just decided I am not spending time there because the amount of time and energy that is sucked into social media is not the most efficient use of people's activism or time. It can take 5 minutes to send me an email, whereas the back and forth and the energy that it takes to engage there, it didn't feel worth it to me. It is not the most efficient way to show up. So I appreciate you.
Yeah.
Yeah, what comes up for you there?
Yeah, I was just going to say that the algorithms on Facebook, for example, and most of the major social media platforms, they're not designed to inform us. They're not designed to give us balanced information. They're not even designed to connect us with the people that we miss the most or love the most or would like to spend the most time with. Those algorithms are designed to keep us on the platforms as long as possible, because the longer we're on, more paid advertising the platforms receive. And so the longer we're on, the more advertising they can show us, the more money the platform receives. So at the end of the day, we're consumers. If it's free, then maybe you yourself are the product. And I think that's what's happening on social media is other people are getting paid to keep our attention, and we are the product.
Yeah, it's just so dystopian to think about how those of us who spend a lot of time on social media have become the product for these large tech companies. That makes me think about the work that you've been doing these last several months to organize federal workers. Can you talk about how the information chaos relates to what is going on in the country right now?
Sure. So, first, let me share what we mean by information chaos. I think intuitively we understand that there's so much information coming at us, we're struggling to understand it. But the term information chaos, or in the book, we call it information disorder, is really referring to a couple of phenomenon, including disinformation, malinformation. These are just fancy ways of saying rumors and lies and gossip. There's a lot of rumors, lies, and gossip in our digital world. Before the advent of social media, we used to gather around the radio, or even before cable television, there were maybe a handful of television networks that provided news. And so the grand majority of people were listening to just a few different sources of news and information. And so those networks defined the agenda. So if the networks were saying that there was an earthquake in Indonesia and all three networks were saying that, And that's what everybody in the country would be talking about because everybody's following more or less shared sources of information. But now we're all following our own sources of information. Anybody can be a content creator, anybody can put their opinion out there, anybody can put a reel on social media and develop a following. And that means that we're all following our own curated, specialized group of sources, and we get our news from very specialized places. The news that I'm following may not have anything to do with the news you're following, and they may not have anything to do with what my family's following, and they may not have anything to do with what the leader of my country is following. And so that means that we're vulnerable to adopting very different narratives about what's happening in our country and to groups that are perhaps manipulating information for their own narrow interests. And I would even say foreign governments who would like to see us divided and who are focused on their own narrow interests, and they are willing to lie. So there's a lot of intentional disinformation. And it feels these days like we're living in two separate worlds, more than two, but they're sort of two prominent sets of narratives that are happening in our country. And there aren't a lot of places where we can come together and figure out, okay, of all the things we're hearing, what's actually happening, what's true, what's real, and what makes sense.
When you say that foreign governments are manipulating us, I go to also thinking about the governments in this country as well, manipulating the news. And what you just shared made me think about perhaps there are stages of development in how news is shared. Perhaps there's something else coming. I don't know. But what occurs to me is that we used to be in this paradigm where there were shared sources and the news there was a monopoly on the news. And before thinking about being an activist 25 years ago as a student, it was like, okay, these big companies control all the news. It's monolithic. And now we've gotten to this place where it's very diversified. And because of that, also power is distributed in new ways, which is not necessarily a bad thing, right? The power is redistributed. It's something for us to grapple with, and it's not all bad, but it has led to extreme polarization. And so I'm curious about what a third phase of development might be, where we have more distributed power, more diversified sources, and yet are interacting with what is happening in a way that is generative and supportive as opposed to destructive like it is right now. I'm curious what comes up for you.
I love that. I love that because it says to me that you're thinking about where we're at right now, not as a permanent state, but as just one step on a pathway to finding the middle ground and the right balance. The man who created the World Wide Web, his explicit intention was to increase cooperation and enable us to talk to each other and work together for the greater good. And that's not happening right now, but it doesn't mean it can't ever happen. There's a whole community of people in the US and around the world who are actively working on the challenge of how do we design our social media platforms? How do we regulate the information environment, not to stifle anything? I think most people see the value in having access to an incredible, vast amount of information. We need to manage it and regulate it and design it in a way that it actually serves the purpose of collaboration and effective communication and helping us live better lives and make better decisions. And so there's a whole tech for social cohesion community. I love to follow their work, and they will go mainstream at some point. There's a lot of experimentation happening right now. I don't know when that'll happen, but at some point we'll figure out how to manage and get to the point where we can actually use the online platforms for making our lives better.
To be honest, I feel like I'm not necessarily optimistic, but I'm also not pessimistic. I mean, I think it's one of our tasks in this moment to be like, we do not know what will happen. And that optimism is like, oh, it'll be okay. Pessimism is like, it won't be okay. And hope is, well, it's possible. Therefore, I will work as hard as I possibly can for it. And so that the tech for social cohesion that you just mentioned, that's a really hopeful project. Like we need to be working on alternatives. So it seems like there are two, probably more than two, but there's two actions that we have to take right now. One is imagining a different way of doing things, and then also practicing in the moment new ways of interacting with what is.
Absolutely. So the book, Overcoming Information Chaos, has 14 authors. I gathered experts from different angles on the issue of information, disinformation, social cohesion, atrocity prevention, data privacy, and all these things. And so everybody came with a different perspective. And as we met and tried to make sense of what's happening, the one thing we all agreed on, and it's essentially the thesis of the book, is that nobody's coming to save us from the polarization and the disinformation. And there are some real entrenched interests in the tech corporate world that will not make it easy for us to regulate platforms. And so, right now, the best we can do probably is to save ourselves, is to figure out how we ourselves can cope better and manage better the information at our fingertips so that at least we ourselves are not contributing to the problem and that we perhaps are learning and growing together as we figure out how to manage this in a way that does no harm and perhaps even does some good.
And taking responsibility for how we show up
That's right.
with ourselves and with each other. So I'm thinking about conflict, and I think that listeners can imagine and know firsthand lots of different ways that all of the rumors and lies and gossip contribute to conflict, whether online or offline. I'm curious if there's aspects of how it contributes to conflict that you'd like to highlight that might help people think about how this is showing up in tense dynamics with other people in their own lives.
Yeah. So there's just general misinformation and rumors. And that's one thing. That's going to happen. But there's something specific related to conflict and violent social conflict, violent political conflict. And that is the way we talk to each other, the kinds of information we share, the nature of the information we share. So, amidst all of the information and types of information disorder, some of it is more benign. You have misinformation, for example. This is information that may be incorrect or may be problematic, but you don't share it with the intention of causing harm. On the other end of the spectrum, there are ways of speaking, the specific words we use and specific turns of phrase that actually foment conflict and they foment violence. There is a group of researchers in recent years and over the past decade or so that were trying to understand how language affects conflict and violent conflict. And they realized that some of the categories that we have don't really do justice to this connection. And so there's a new project called the Dangerous Speech Project. And they've coined this new term called dangerous speech as opposed to hate speech. Dangerous speech is speech that is designed and utilized and leveraged specifically to foment and exacerbate violent conflict. So, for example, in the research they did, they found dehumanizing language is particularly dangerous. I'll give the example of the Rwandan genocide back in 1994. The group that ended up committing the genocide, for a long time prior to that, some of their radio programs were calling members of the other group cockroaches, those cockroaches. And they just repeated that over and over again until their listeners stopped seeing members of the other group as fellow human beings, as people like them, and they started to see them as subhuman. They started to see them as simply insects, pests. And so they dehumanized a whole group of people using very specific language. And then when the instigators began the call for mass murder, the fact that they had already dehumanized this other group of people made it easier for people to step up and hurt people and kill people. So dehumanizing language, where you start to call people animals, or, broad generalizations of those people are criminals, those people are lazy, those people are cockroaches, they're not actual human beings. So that's one example of dangerous speech.
Is there any document or that says this is the one page of dangerous speech?
Yeah, there's a website which I can give you to share with your audience as a part of the podcast notes.
That's perfect. I also think about how intent matters, but impact matters more.
Yeah,
I would say that the majority of this that is shared probably isn't coming from someone deliberately, intentionally trying
that's right.
to.
That's right. Because of this question of intent versus impact, in order for it to be subject to legal action in the US anyway, it has to, like what you say, it has to be intended to cause harm. And that's a very high bar, because a lot of people do casually say things that do cause negative consequences, but without intention, or maybe just a little bit of intention. So intention's very, very tricky.
Right. And maybe that's why dangerous feels more effective than hate, as the hate infers intent, hateful intent, whereas you may not feel hate, but your language can still be dangerous. It makes me think about how there's different ways to name something that someone else is saying that may lead to a better result than others, right?
Yeah.
We call someone out and isolate them, that could have the impact of furthering that action. Whereas if we name something that's happening with a different energy, it may bring them toward us.
That's right. I'm a big fan, Catherine, of nonviolent communication, which is more about not the intention that you have when you're speaking to someone, but how they understand it. So in nonviolent communication, people can say, okay, what you said actually made me feel really bad. It made me feel very distressed. It elevated my nervous system, and I'm really struggling with that. I know you didn't intend that, but that's the effect it had. Maybe because I have my own trauma, maybe because I have my own lived experience and implicit associations. And in nonviolent communication, it's part of the structure that you can say, in the future, I would like to ask, could you please, use that particular word less? Or maybe shift the way you talk about things. So I really love the paradigm of nonviolent communication. I think that's a really important piece of everyday peace building.
Me too. I would refer listeners to my interview with Roxy Manning on naming harmful impact with nonviolent communication. I think that's a great one for folks to be listening to.
Roxy's fabulous.
Yes,
So
you
glad
know
I've
Roxy?
interviewed her. Yes, I've taken NVC courses with her.
Yeah, so I highly recommend that. Before we name things to someone else, it's so important for us to have our own practices of discerning and choosing how we are interacting with information. What practices do you rely on for managing the tsunami of information around us and interacting with it in a discernful way?
The most important thing I do, and I think the most important thing we collectively need to do, is simply to slow down. Slow down. The pace of our society is very fast. But the reality is, when we respond quickly, oftentimes it's not a thoughtful response. It's more of a reaction based on our initial emotional reaction. When we move quickly, we're more likely to make errors and to be operating out of our implicit biases and out of our subconscious programming, and close that gap between who we want to be, our noble intentions, our noble selves, our best selves, and who we sometimes show up as, given that we have a nervous, we're human beings, we make mistakes, we have nervous systems that are triggered by all kinds of things. Practice of media literacy helps us close that gap because, by slowing down and perhaps reading something and waiting to process it and to really figure out, like, is it from a trusted source? Is it true? Is it accurate? What do I think? What is my opinion about it? That whole string of thought processes takes time. And if you're not slowing down, giving yourself that time, and you're much more likely to be acting out of the lower self or the triggered nervous system than the higher self.
Yeah, that pause creates the ability for us to discern our response. When you said wait, I thought of the acronym WAIT, which is why am I talking?
Yeah.
Right? Before you send something out, it's me. Why am I sending this out? And does it need to go out now? Can I wait even longer before I put that thing out there into the world?
Yeah, and that's the difference between like intentionally driving how you show up in the world and how you communicate and creating the kind of world you want to live in versus being dragged along by external forces and perhaps other people's agendas.
Just really taking responsibility for how there is no one out there to save us and really taking responsibility for how we're showing up.
Yeah, for example, I see sometimes on social media people say, "Well, I don't know if this is true, but if it is, it really makes me."
Yeah.
It's one of those things that I used to see and I used to think, well, if you don't know if it's true, why are you sharing it? And why are you getting mad? The first step should be, can you just spend a couple of minutes doing a quick Google search, see if you can find other news stories to corroborate that? I just did it today. There was a new news source that I hadn't heard of. And so I typed in the name of the news source, all the different sources. It'll tell you, oh, this one's trustworthy or not trustworthy, or it leans left, it leans right. People criticize it as being propaganda, or it's been around for 100 years and has like a trusted audience for 100 years and has won journalism awards. So even just that little Google search about your sources can pull up a lot of information that'll help you know, is this something I can and should trust or not? It doesn't actually take that long to just do a couple of quick searches about the information itself, about the sources. See, a lot of people are on social media for entertainment, which is fine. I mean, I get on social media for entertainment. That's certainly nothing to be judgmental about. But if you're on social media for entertainment, and you come across one of these things, just don't share it. Like, if you don't have time to verify it, that's no big deal. Just don't share it. Please don't share it.
I wonder what your suggestions are for when people hear people repeating misinformation or they hear it being repeated in conversation, like with their families. What are effective ways to address that?
The research, first and foremost, shows that it's more impactful if you're talking to somebody who knows you and who trusts you. Otherwise, there's a backfire effect. When somebody you don't know comes along and tries to correct you or tell you that the information you shared is somehow erroneous, the natural instinct is to actually double down on that information. So it's like putting water on a grease fire. It just ends up backfiring. That's something I wish more people knew, because if you're trying to correct a random stranger online, especially if you're using harsh tone or if you're calling somebody a name, that's not likely to change their minds. They're going to be convinced that they're wrong just because you said it's not a good use of time. It's not useful, and actually exacerbates the problem. If people would just recognize that that's not useful and I'm not going to do that anymore, that in and of itself would have a huge impact on our information environment. If you really need to or want to correct someone, it's better if you do it with somebody you trust, and if you do it compassionately, perhaps using nonviolent communication, and don't call somebody names. They're not going to respond positively. Call them a name.
And with the nonviolent communication, for folks who are less familiar with that framework, that is okay. If someone does say something who trusts you, who you are able to settle your own nervous system before you reach out to them, there's 4 steps: observation, feelings, needs, and requests. A basic thing that you might say is like, first asking, can I talk to you about this? Then, like, when you said that, I felt like, I don't know, I felt really activated.
Or I was confused when you said that, as I've understood something different about that topic.
I felt worried, right? I felt nervous when you shared that, etc. How do you feel in your body? Yeah. Then what do you need? What might the need be there if you were confused?
Yeah, I need to understand better that thing that you shared. Could you tell me why you shared it, or where did you get that information? I mean, that's a great question. Where did you get the information? I'm trying to understand, is it something that I can trust or not? And in order for me to make that judgment for myself, I need to understand, where did you get that information?
And also, like, if we already know, we've already gone to Googled review this site and we're clear that it actually is information.
And you'll actually have a good answer.
Yeah. We might say, like, I have a need for us to like be in community together, like for us to like be sharing good information, for us to like for there to be peace in the world and us to get along. And I feel scared when there's misinformation being shared. And so my request is, can you look at this? Like, we talk about, what are you putting out there, or what are we putting out there?
And in terms of deep needs, like in nonviolent communication, you often think about like deep intrinsic human needs. But if you take that maybe a step further, our democracy, in order to function, needs a public sphere where we can debate peacefully and nonviolently in order to come to the best decisions about how to govern ourselves. And so democracy actually requires public spaces where there is a certain amount of information integrity, and where people are showing up with the best of intentions to exchange information and try to better understand information and come to a shared understanding about what's happening and what the different options are and how to move forward. And so, yes, our democracy has a deep need for information integrity. So is what's happening right now in alignment with that or not? And if not, what can we do to build our ability to exchange as good citizens should about what's happening in our country?
Yeah. I'm just pausing for a moment.
I'm appreciating these pauses, by the way. This is good.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I try to walk my talk, and yeah, it's like,
well, I mean, what we're doing is actually putting it into practice rather than just have some fast reactive conversation. We're both being intentional. Like, what exactly is it I'm trying to communicate? And like, give me a minute to figure out how. I love it. I love it.
Yeah. Yeah. People who are not my podcast guests don't know that at the beginning of the podcast, I set a couple of agreements with guests, and one is that either one of us can call for a pause. And I imagine that I probably pause much more than most podcast hosts. Like, I've got my questions here, and I'm trying to respond to what you're sharing, what's coming up for me. And so I often do these long pauses that I then edit out. So that's, I appreciate you naming that, because people who listen aren't aware that that's what I'm doing, because it sounds like
beautiful. I love it.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, no, it feels important to me too. So I'm going to pause again, and but listeners won't hear the pause. When we talk about the pause, another thing that comes up for me is before we were talking and I was reflecting on the conversation, I was thinking about my practices around information. I do not read very much news. I spend very little time on social media. In last year, I got to a point where I decided to get off of Instagram. And I did that because it felt like everything I saw, especially about the genocide in Gaza, which was a key piece that
Mm.
what was coming through my feed. And I didn't want that to stop. I mean, I was grateful for people sharing that information. And also, it felt like every single thing I saw deserved a moment of silence. I felt like I wasn't honoring the genocide and the violence and the
Mm.
people that I was seeing and the very real grief of that. And also to show up in the ways I'm showing up here, I could, you know, pass a resolution around not sending arms to Israel. And I can make calls to legislators when key things come up. But all the other things that I was engaged in, those deserved my time too. And so I could have a practice of looking at Instagram and honoring, giving the moments of silence. Or if there's only so much time in the day, that time could be invested in the things that I'm engaged in here in my community. And so I made a very conscious choice not to engage there. And so when we talk about waiting and pausing, I think a key part of that is also honoring like the fear and the grief and the rage and the disgust that come up as we see the news so that we can honor it and then choose how we respond to it instead of just reacting and putting it out there more.
What you've just described, Catherine, is a beautiful example of media literacy for peace building. It really is.
Okay.
Rather than just scrolling, no matter what comes and no matter how you feel, you stopped, you evaluated what was coming through your feed, you figured out how you felt about it, and then you made a conscious decision. You made a conscious decision to rebalance how you were spending your time so that you weren't just getting locked into doom scrolling and the negativity bias. And instead, you were preserving an important part of your time to actually do constructive things in your own community. This is media literacy for peace building in a nutshell. And so thank you for providing that example.
Yeah. You're welcome. And thank you. My work, I call my work radical discernment. It's about making choices that honor our personal and collective needs. And that was one decision I felt like I had to make last year. So, how do you do it? What decisions do you make about taking in information?
20 years ago, one of my favorite things to do was to get the Sunday newspaper and to sit down and go through it from cover to cover and just take in the stories at my own pace and reflect on what's happening in the world. For me, those days are gone. I'm not able to do that anymore. And I think a lot of people have shifted from ink and paper news to the online variety. That's what all the data shows. And so once you make that shift, you have to decide, okay, which sources am I going to follow? What news is important to me? How much time do I have to spend on reading and taking in the news? And we have to be really honest with ourselves. I don't like to spend an inordinate amount of time reading the news. I also have severe ADHD, so I'm not able to read long articles easily like I used to when I would get the actual newspaper. And so I have bounced around. I've done subscriptions to a lot of different magazines or newspapers, and I've cycled through them multiple times just trying to find what is the one that makes the most sense for me. The one magazine that I have found that really meets my needs is The Economist. It comes once a week and it gives little short paragraph snippets about the most important things happening in the world. It covers all the different regions. I'm a retired diplomat, so world news is really important to me. And then every once in a rare while does a really deep dive on an important issue in the US. And then online news, I continue to struggle with for years until, I do scroll and I get a little bit through scrolling. I do find things in scrolling that I want to read and I will spend more time with. But I finally solved my own issue by signing up for Google News alerts. I think I have 10 active Google News alerts. I figured out what are the issues that are most important to me and that I really want to follow closely. And then I just set up the Google News alert to put that particular news from multiple outlets in my inbox. You can set it up for once a day or once a week. And then I have a third source, which is people I trust and peers who are working on similar things. Like they might share and say, this article is a really good one. If you want to understand X, like it's a must read. So if somebody I know and trust and whose judgment I trust suggests something, then I read a smattering of that as well. So those are maybe the three ways that I get my news. But I stopped watching television and television news many years ago. So I don't get any news that way. Yeah, it's interesting. And I think you and I are probably of a similar age, and just how radically the media industry has changed during our lifetimes. Opening chapter of the book is that we are in the midst of this paradigm shifting, game changing evolution in humankind, in the way we function. We haven't figured out how to respond appropriately yet, but we're on the front lines and we are pioneers, and we have a chance to help figure out how to manage it and help other people figure out how to manage it. Hopefully the book will do a little bit of that for people.
As we're on the topic of like what news that we consume, I imagine people might be wondering what I do. I do look at LinkedIn, that I'm there for my business. So I look, I see news there.
It's interesting. It actually has really state-of-the-art reports and firsthand information from people who are actually at the site of the news. I've got a lot of people in my LinkedIn world who, like, for example, when that Turkish university student was taken off the street by ICE early in this administration, one of her lawyers was in my LinkedIn feed. If she was posting in LinkedIn on real time, like, here's what's happening in that legal case, here's the brief that I submitted to the lawyer, to the judge. So those kinds of things are what I find on LinkedIn. I find LinkedIn an amazing source of information.
For some reason, so many people are like, I spend no time here. And I'm like, I intend to spend more time there for my work. It doesn't suck me in the same ways that Instagram did. And then I read the headlines of my local paper, and if there's something interesting there, I will read that. Thank goodness I live in a place that's not the best quality, but at least we have a local paper. And then I also subscribe to an email called What the Fuck Happened, that is good for federal news. And it's just like a very quick digest that I read for like a minute at the end of the day, just to kind of orient to what's going on.
I'm really glad you mentioned LinkedIn versus Instagram. Earlier, we talked about tech for social cohesion. And I just want to point out that different social media platforms have different cultures. They have different rules of engagement, different levels of tolerance for different things, different intentions. And so, for example, X is going to be very different from LinkedIn. LinkedIn is going to be very different from YouTube. YouTube is very different from, Instagram or TikTok. But it's a case in point, really, the culture on LinkedIn, the culture that is created by the people who are on LinkedIn using it, it's got a more professional tone because that was the intention of its founders. The algorithms are designed for more professional level interaction, higher quality interaction, and it is used as a professional space. And so the norms and the culture are very different. Imagine a social media platform that doesn't yet exist, but one that is intended to help people collaborate more effectively to provide joint community service in their county or in their state or their country or even across the world. Like, we can create those spaces, and it's about the intention, it's about the design, it's about the culture. We can create spaces that will be more constructive. And then the other thing I wanted to respond to was the fact that you read your local news headlines. I know you're a local official, and so it's probably pretty essential for you. But one of the things that we talk about in the book is the fact that news deserts are becoming more widespread across the US as people have started to get more of their news online. The news we follow is more national level news or world news as opposed to local news. And so a lot of local newspapers have gone out of business or their budgets have decreased, their revenues have decreased so much that they really can only produce a couple of pages. And so one of the ways that we can support information for democracy and media literacy for peace building is to support our local news. If we want to be good citizens, the way that our founding fathers intended, the best place to do that is in our local communities. And we can't do that well unless we're getting good information. And so we need to invest in our local news. We need to consume our local news. We need to recreate somehow spaces where we can share news and information about what's happening in our own communities.
Yeah, I agree wholeheartedly. And it also gives me so much empathy for folks who don't vote the same way that I do or who disagree with me on the issues, because even when I think about how our local news is being covered, I'm glad it exists. I invest in it. That's important. It's a privilege, and I'm grateful. And also, I watch how our city council meetings are covered, and the reporter does not do a great job. He will quote the one dissenting vote and not the rest of the arguments for why people voted a certain way. If people just read that at face value and are not taught to question,
Yeah.
and they didn't actually go to the meeting, if they just saw and read the article, they would have a very different take on what happened in the meeting than what actually happened. So even when you're looking at the best source of news from your place, assuming that we don't have the whole picture and that not having the whole picture is typically at the root of most of our conflicts and
Yes.
disagreements.
Yes. And it's interesting to hear you say that because one of the criticisms of creators and the fact that anybody can put information online is that most people don't have training in journalism and journalistic standards and journalistic ethics. And providing balanced news coverage is a fundamental principle of professional journalism. So you would hope that the journalists that are working in our more established media outlets would have a higher level of professionalism and journalistic standards. But we need to work on that. Clearly, it's something we need to work on.
Yeah, he's a young guy who's writing in this culture of inflammatory news. And so he looks for drama. Like I put forward and we passed an ordinance to make all meetings have hybrid participation. So people could be online and in person, especially so that folks with disabilities could access our public meetings. And he didn't write a report on that. There was no drama. So that was not covered. An instance like this demonstrates how people are writing to the drama, writing to inflame, because that's also what gets clicks and what it's a local paper that's trying to make money. And
that's right. That's right. So yeah, there are commercial pressures. There's also negativity bias. It's one of the biases that we universally have as human beings is a tendency to pay more attention to things going wrong and to the drama. You know, if I'm thinking about what you just said from a perspective of peace journalism, I'm going to get excited that you passed an ordinance that enables more people to participate in your council meetings because they don't actually have to get up and go in person. They can stay home. And that's amazing. A peace journalist would cover that and get excited. Thank you for passing that. That gives me hope.
Yeah, no, it gave me hope too. I hear so much hope in what you're sharing, that like people are working on creating alternative news sources and social media sources and programs and projects, and that there's a lot being invested in this space, and that I hear you saying like maybe there is a way to train our brains to do this better. And I see the divestment from research and the dismantling of news sources and everything that the Trump administration is trying to do to control and manipulate how information is shared in this country. So I'm genuinely curious, do you believe that change is possible? And if so, can you share more about what's giving you hope for listeners who may be skeptical about that?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, first of all, I look at these things from a much deeper perspective than just what's in the headlines today or this week or this year. I mentioned earlier that I'm a serious meditator. I'm also a deeply, deeply spiritual person. I believe that there are spiritual forces, a universal consciousness underlying everything that happens in our lives, in our world. And Martin Luther King said, the arc of history bends towards justice. I believe he was speaking that from spiritual inspiration. I think that ultimately the ways of love and peace and truth will win out over whatever forces of division and hatred and violence. With the advent of digital technology, we can now communicate around the world. We have access to any and every bit of information we could possibly want at the touch of a button. And the way we organize ourselves as human society is becoming increasingly sophisticated. Of course, that brings a lot of conflict. I am a member of the Baha'i faith. And in our writings, it says peace is not only possible, it is inevitable. The real question is how long it takes us to get there. Question is how long it takes us to get there. We can live through tremendous catastrophe and calamity that brings us to our knees before we decide to start doing things differently. Or we can be more intentional about building the kind of world that I think most people want to live in, a more just, peaceful world. And I think media literacy is an important part of it. And I do not suffer from negativity. But look at the conversation we're having right now. You obviously are someone who has overcome challenges and is being intentional about trying. Who knows what impact you're having in the world. But I see you as intentionally making choices to try to have a constructive influence on your own life and your community. I'm being intentional about how I show up in the world and how I am trying to create a better world around me and where I can. It is possible. And if you and I can do it, anybody can do it. And if we all do it, or at least a critical mass of people do it, then we're going to be able to shape things for the better. There is research that shows that real sustainable change comes from the bottom up. It starts in our communities. And we can change our social norms. Nonviolent collective action and big citizen uprisings, one of the documented impacts of broad organizing and social change movements is that they do shift our social norms. They do collectively help us to adapt and evolve. If 25% of people in a community, whether it's our own local community or our national community, whatever you define as community, shift our social norms, there's a trigger point at around the 25% mark. We don't need every single person in the United States to become peace builders in their own lives and communities. But if the solid 25% of us are committed to it, we're being vocal about it, and we're being active, that's enough to create a tipping point and a culture change to help us adopt new values and behaviors. I mean, I think it boils down to whether you have a growth mindset, whether you believe that things can change. And if you fundamentally believe that things can change, then they can change for the better. And you can help make them change for the better.
I think of that actually via Butler quote. I'm going to misphrase it, but everything is changed. God is changed. If we don't believe that change is possible, then we haven't been paying attention.
That's right. I love that.
Any other words of wisdom for folks who are grappling with tension or conflict in their workplaces, in their communities, in their lives that is somehow related to all of the information chaos that we grapple with in this day and age?
Maybe I'll bring it home with a final reference to my book. Peace is possible. It's possible in our own inner worlds. It's possible in our homes. It's possible in our communities. It's possible in our country. It's possible in our world, without a doubt. The last chapter of my book is called A Peace Builder's Manifesto for the Digital Age, and it outlines a framework and steps people can take, everyday people, anyone, you, me, any of your listeners, any of their neighbors can take to help that process, building community, inclusive, welcoming, safe spaces and communities is at the heart of it.
I've started ending my podcast episodes by sharing a gift that I receive from guests. And one thing
That's lovely.
yeah. And one thing that is sticking out for me is when I ask you this question about whether you believe that change is possible, your brow furrows a little bit. And it's like, wait, of course it's possible. How could it not be possible? And your embodiment of possibility. Like, yeah, this is really hard. You have both this deep spiritual commitment to the possibility that humans are capable of, and your feet are very much in this world facing the really hard stuff right now. And so I'm just taking a gift of your face when I ask you that question.
Thank you for reflecting that back. Yes, creating peace in our lives and our world is one of the hardest things we will ever do. Nobody ever said it would be easy. I'm not saying it's easy. I think it's worthwhile. It starts with you being safe for the people in your own life. Bringing peace to my life and my home started with me embodying safety. Even when people were coming at me, even when they were rejecting me, even when they were screaming insults at me, even when they were, trying to harm me, if you can stay in love energy, and that doesn't always mean like kindness and all the touchy feel good stuff. You have to stay in love energy, and that includes the energy of nonviolence. For example, the nonviolence in the sense of the civil rights movement. You stay in love energy and you create safety for others, no matter what's happening. It will ripple out, and it influences and transforms and catalyzes everything around you. So it starts with each one of us.
And that safety, embodying safety, can mean removing ourselves from an unsafe situation, unsafe relationship, which can also mean not looking at Instagram.
Yes, absolute boundaries. Boundaries are critical for creating peace. Absolutely.
So how can people learn more about your book, about your work? Tell us.
My website is www.peacebuildersunite.com. I'm on Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn. Haven't ventured too much into the TikTok and YouTube territories yet, although maybe that's in the future. But my website is the best place to find information.
Great. And your book?
My book is called Overcoming Information Chaos, a guide to cultivating peaceful communities in the digital age. It is published by Upriver Press. It is available now for pre-sale on bookstore.org, on Amazon, on Barnes & Noble, online, so people can get it in whatever places they buy their books.
Great. I really enjoyed talking with you and your book, and thank you. Thank you for everything you're doing.
Thank you, Katherine. This has been wonderful.
Thank you so much for joining me. If you loved this conversation and want to hear more, I invite you to do 3 things. First, go to the Conflict Decoded show page wherever you listen to podcasts and tap the plus sign or click on follow. That way, you'll be the first to hear my new episodes and I will get to share them with you. Second, while you're there, if you would be willing to give the podcast a 5-star review or share it with a friend, I would be very grateful. And finally, if you are eager to receive the latest episodes by email, along with other morsels of guidance to support you and your work in the world, I invite you to subscribe to my Saturday Love Letters to Changemakers. To do this, visit callingsandcourage.com/subscribe. Thank you for listening. Until next time, take good care.